This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. You might find this hard to believe, but serendipity, those nice little surprises in life, that's the way I run my podcast. Now, perhaps that's not exactly efficient. Perhaps that's not the best way to do things. And perhaps in the future, that will change and there will be more organization, more optimization. But as of right now, there's a lot of happy accidents. This episode is a happy accident. I've had a guest on my show several times, Ryan Holiday, an author, writes some really good stuff, has inspired me with all of his interest in Marcus Aurelius, which I absolutely love, Stoicism, kind of like the angry Buddhist. Anyways, I'll reach out to Ryan about once every 5 or 6 months and say, Ryan, give me some guest ideas. Introduce me to someone. My guest today was an introduction from Ryan Holiday, Steven Kotler. And today, Steven and I talk about flow. His book that came out this year, The Rise of Superman, goes into great detail. However, this is a fun conversation for me. This really starts to break open the idea of flow. Flow, the zone, being in the zone. This is the magic. This is the elixir that we all want in our brain. This is the feeling that we want. I'm very fortunate to be able to ask Ryan for great leads, and I'm very fortunate that Steven Kotler joins me for this great conversation. Let me give an example, and I'm not even going to tell the audience where I'm going yet exactly. I just want to give a personal anecdote about myself because I have a feeling it's going to be right into your solar plexus of the world. So as a young man, 17, 18, I was good enough at baseball that I can remember there were certain points in time where that 90-mile-an-hour fastball just felt easy. I can still remember the feeling of hitting a few home runs where it just felt like, wow, I didn't do anything. And when I stopped baseball in my early 20s, there was this regret. And I couldn't necessarily maybe it's the competition that I was missing. But it was almost a depression. I've talked to other guys when they leave sports and they have this similar feeling, especially guys that go on to play professionally. Then in the mid to late 90s, I put my first website. And I remember I would get lost. I had to learn coding. And I would get lost in this for a 15-hour stretch. And I'd be so productive. And I'd be like, there's just a euphoric feeling. But I didn't connect it to the baseball feeling. And then time went on. And I put some books out. And I remember my first book had sold really well. My second book, HarperCollins, gave me a lot of money. And the first draft, I turned them in. Actually, it wasn't the first draft. The manuscript I gave them, they said, this is terrible. We don't like this. Well, it was very similar to my first book. But I was so mad, I turned around and I sat down and I just knocked this final manuscript out literally in like less than 60 days. It was like boom, 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 boom for 80,000 words. Time goes on. It was just there's this euphoric feeling of just in the middle of that. Time goes on. I get introduced to yoga. And then at the end of yoga, after, sweating your rear end off for 90 minutes, you just sit there and you're like, God, what am I? Am I drunk? I can see everything so clearly. And then there's one more on top of that. Last year in 2013, I took the stage about 45 times. I remember one day, I think I was somewhere in China and I gave 7 presentations in one day. They were all about an hour long, generally the same material, but there was no notes or anything, really a couple slides. But I remember that feeling easy and this euphoria. And so this being on stage and euphoria, I have a feeling you know what's been happening to me and what I'm addicted to, don't you?
Those are great stories, Michael. Thanks for starting off there.
You know what's wrong with me, don't you?
I know exactly what's wrong with you. It's wrong with all of us. Definitely wrong with me.
So listen, talk about flow. And I guess Michael Jordan back in the day might have, I don't know if it would be the same thing. He would call it the zone, but talk about flow because that's what we're really talking about. Why don't we dig into that and tear it apart? If you want to give some feedback on what I just described, or just jump right into flow and let the audience know what I was going through.
Yeah, let's start with flow and then work backwards into your stories because there's such great data in your stories that'll be fun to use as case studies. But flow, as you rightly pointed out, right, there are tons of synonyms for this word. The flow science, the study of this peculiar state you're talking about, dates back about 150 years. So we've had a lot of synonyms along the way. Peak experience, peak performance, runner's high, being in the zone. If you're a jazz musician, you're in the pocket. If you're a basketball player, you're unconscious. If you're a stand-up comic, you're in the forever box. Scientists prefer the term flow, and it's something of a technical term. It refers to the fact that when you're in this state, these moments of kind of total absorption where you get so focused on the task at hand that everything vanishes, right? Your sense of self disappears. Time passes very strangely. Sometimes it speeds up. 5 hours will go by in like 5 minutes, slows down, and you can get that freeze frame effect. Anybody who's been in a car crash. And throughout, all aspects of performance go through the roof, right? Mental and physical. And they go so far through the roof that every action, every decision seems effortless, fluid, perfectly leads to the next. In other words, the state itself feels flowy. And when researchers went out to study this, especially kind of in the middle years in the 60s and 70s, flow was the term that kept popping up when people were talking about the state of consciousness. So, now we technically define it in the shorthand as simply an optimal state of consciousness where we feel our best and perform our best.
I always think back to watching, there was a certain point in time, maybe it was the late 80s, and Larry Bird was in a 3-point contest, and he literally told everybody before it started for the NBA All-Star game, I'm going to beat you guys. Why are you even here? And the very last shot, he threw the damn thing up. I don't know how far, the 3-point line is for the NBA. He threw it up and started walking away and put his finger up in the air before it even hit swish. I mean, it's, and he could apparently summon it on will.
So let's drill into what you just said, because there's a lot of actually cool data if we just break down what Larry was able to do. First of all, basketball and basketball literature is filled with great examples of flow. One of the most famous examples of group flow, which is kind of the shared collective version of the state, comes out of basketball. I'm blanking. I want to say Oscar Robertson, and I just lost his name. It'll come back to me in a second. But what Larry was talking about, so one of the things that happens in flow is your brain's pattern recognition system gets jacked up, right? So this is your ability to take in information more quickly. You talked about your senses feeling heightened. This is because norepinephrine and dopamine, two of the chemicals that underpin the flow state, the neurochemicals that drive it, amplify pattern recognition. So you're taking in more information per second. You're processing it more quickly, meaning you're making connections and links between it more quickly, and you're processing it using kind of a greater swatch of your brain, right? So you have a bigger database for the pattern recognition system to search through. What was happening to Larry, why he could turn around and walk away, right, is when your pattern recognition system is so jacked up, just kind of being able to put up the shot in the beginning, right? There was enough information coming in about trajectory and angle and everything else. And Larry had taken enough shots beforehand. Everything was perfect. And he knew it before it even left his hand.
That's awesome, right? Isn't it just awesome?
It's amazing.
I mean, but as we're talking about basketball, if you think back to the great 80s battles with the Lakers and the Celtics, I think if you think back and one's old enough to have witnessed some of that, was there a flow state on both teams at certain points in time of that rivalry?
Yeah. So what's interesting here? So what at a broad level, right? You have to first know that flow is ubiquitous, right? It's not just sports. It shows up anywhere and anyone, provided certain initial conditions are met. That said, researchers now believe it underpins pretty much every gold medal and world championship that's ever been won. And in basketball, and Adam Braun, the founder of Pencils for Promise, who was a point guard for the University of Rhode Island, and I teamed up and we wrote a Forbes blog about this very topic. Essentially, especially in something like the Final Four, you're looking at teams competing based on flow states. Who can get into more flow states more quickly? And usually the team that's in flow at the end of the game will win.
Yeah. I mean, I think a great example of that last year, I don't want to stick in basketball, but I was thinking about the University of Kentucky basketball team, which had all these star players, great freshmen. They really kind of muddled through the season. And then all of a sudden they got on a run and got to the finals. And clearly they got to the state.
Yeah, what's interesting about flow, there's two things underneath what you just dug at. The first is that what we now know is it's no longer this kind of elusive state that only kind of shows up when magic happens. We really understand, or really starting to understand, I guess, where it comes from in the brain. As a result of this, we're starting to understand that flow states have triggers, right? These are preconditions that lead to more flow. In basketball, when it's group flow, this kind of shared collective version, to have where a whole team comes together. People have this experience if they've sung in a church choir, or played in a band, or taken part in a brainstorming session, right? Or played a team sport, of course. And it's, you see it with a band, right? When the band suddenly finds their groove and the level of creativity just goes through the roof. Same thing on a basketball team. You see it when they find their groove and performance goes through the roof. I always think when you start getting a lot of no-look passes, I think passing, for whatever reason, is the greatest indicator of group flow.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You just kind of realize there's a whole just symbiotic type situation going on. Yeah.
It's the same thing Wayne Gretzky said when he said, I skate to where the puck is going to be. When group flow happens, because pattern recognition is jacked up so much, right? You can anticipate where the play is going long before it actually happens. So you can put you can make a pass to where the player is going to be, 3 steps later. And that's astounding Magic Johnson, to go back to your 80s example, was the king of this.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, why don't we talk about the 4 stages of flow? I saw these the other day and I thought, my gosh, this is what I've been struggling with for the last year and a half. So for the last 18 months, approximately, I've been working on research. And, sometimes you just beat your head against the wall and you're like, where is this all going? Where is it going? Where's it going? And then all of a sudden I've noticed in the last month, I've just kind of relaxed. And I'm going through your work and I'm like, okay, I think I know where I am now. Why don't you talk about the 4 stages?
They're really critical. At the Flow Genome Project, right, I don't know how many people we've taught this material to, 50,000, 100,000 people at this point. And the most important thing we can tell you about kind of amplifying the amount of flow in your life is about the flow cycle. The idea here is we used to think flow was a binary, right? Like a light switch. You're either in the zone or you're not. And we now know that's not true at all. Flow is actually a 4-stage cycle. And there's different neurobiology, so different things happening in the brain and the body underneath each stage, right? And you have to move through all 4 stages to restart the flow state. So this, first of all, at a macroscopic level, tells us something important, which is you can't live in a perpetual flow state because a number of stages in the cycle are kind of anti-flow. They feel exactly the opposite of the state, right? But what you can do, and knowing where you are on this map seems to facilitate, as you just pointed out, you can move through the whole cycle more quickly, right? At the front end of a flow state, you have a struggle phase. In this phase, it's skill acquisition, basically. You are loading and overloading the brain with information, right? As if you're a writer, this is your research phase. If you're a baseball player, this is learning to keep your eye on the ball and, swing a bat, et cetera, et cetera. It is really kind of, you're building up the brain's database. And it's very, very slow and painful. And it's called struggle for a reason. Harvard cardiologist Herb Benson gave it that name. He was the guy who mapped a lot of the neurobiology underneath the state originally back in the 90s. He gave it that name for a reason, right? You are literally taking yourself to the brink of madness. You want to keep going until you're unbelievably frustrated. And then you want to quit. Because the second stage, as you also just pointed out, is known as release. Right? You are literally taking your mind off the problem. If you want to look under the hood, right, what's going on here is you are trading conscious processing for subconscious processing, the unconscious. And there are really good reasons for this. You're doing it because the conscious mind, even though it's extremely powerful and can do amazing things, it's also very slow. thought moves about 150 miles an hour. It's very, 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 very energy inefficient. It burns a ton of calories, and your brain already burns a ton of calories. It's 2% of your body weight, but consumes 25% of your energy at rest. So when it's all fired up, it's using massive amounts of calories. To give you an example, chess grandmasters literally sitting at a table pushing pieces of wood around burn 7,500 calories in a day, which is as much as or more than a marathon runner. So very inefficient, very slow, and very limited in RAM, right? Your working memory holds about 4 items at once. It can go out to 9, but about 4 items. On the subconscious side, it's really, really fast. It is extremely energy efficient, and it can hold, at this point, we don't know, an infinite number of items as far as we can tell, right? So you're making this trade. To do that, you have to literally take your mind off the problem. So there's lots of different ways of doing this. You can go for long walks. You can gardening is something I like to do. People build model airplanes, something that kind of involves your hands and your mind and, gets you a little bit of exercise, but not too much. One thing for sure that doesn't work here is television. It messes with your brain waves in a specific way and doesn't actually allow you to go into flow and relax, right? Once you can take your mind off the problem, you kick into the flow state itself, which is the 3rd stage of the cycle. And the flow state is an incredible superhuman high, right? Performance goes through the roof, productivity, motivation, creativity, all these things are incredibly jacked up. Learning, to give you another example, in studies done by the U.S. military, they discovered that in-flow snipers learn target acquisition skills 230 times faster than normal. To give you another example, they redid that experiment and took novice archers and trained them up to the expert level by putting them into flow and then training them, and they found they got there in half the time. So Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours to mastery, what the research says is flow can cut it in half, right? So this huge boost in performance and productivity and everything else in flow. That's the 3rd stage of the cycle. The 4th stage is a recovery phase. And this is really hard for people to navigate for a number of reasons. The first is flow is a very expensive state for the brain to produce. It requires certain neurochemicals, and these require certain minerals and vitamins and food, et cetera, to create, and you burn through them. There's a limited supply. It takes a little while for the brain to make more. And without these chemicals, not only are they performance-enhancing chemicals, but they're some of the most potent feel-good chemicals the brain can produce. So it's a big high followed by a deep, dark low that is really, really difficult, as you kind of pointed out in your introduction. The state is very, very addictive. Researchers don't like the word addictive, so instead they call flow the source code of intrinsic motivation, or autotelic, which means an end in itself, right? But what it really means is that once you start doing something that produces flow, you will go extraordinarily far out of your way to get more of the state. So you've got this really addictive state, maybe the most addictive state on earth, followed by this kind of very mortal, all too human, it's all gone feeling. And it's really critical to hold it together in this stage for 2 reasons. One, if you get stressed out that you're not in flow, which is not uncommon, it happens all the time, and start producing too much cortisol, which is the stress hormone. A little bit is good, it boosts learning, but too much, and you block learning. You basically kick the brain over towards a fight or flight response that blocks learning. And as a result, you'll get the short-term boost of a flow state, but you won't get its long-term benefits. The other thing is, since to restart the whole cycle, right, to get more flow, you have to move from this recovery phase into the struggle phase. And if you're really not up for it in recovery and you're not really relaxed enough for your body to recover, you're going to find it impossible to get up for the serious fight of struggle.
God, you must have just, when this hit you, when you understood what you were in the middle of in terms of this research and writing, that alone must have just been a high. I mean, an unrelated high, but I'm just saying, just absolutely fascinating to piece this together.
You have to understand, to me, because I started this work 15 years ago. And when I started where most people had started, which is I thought I was looking at quasi-mystical experiences. And I got interested in kind of the neurobiology of so-called spiritual experiences. And I started to realize that, a lot of what people were calling spiritual experiences were actually flow states. Now, I was not, by the way, the first person to realize this. A lot of other people have realized it.
Sure.
It just took me a while, to get there myself. But I remember thinking at the time, and this was in the late 90s, damn, I am just not going to live long enough to see these puzzles solved. We're just not going to get there. They're too big. It's too weird. How are you going to ever figure out something like how does time slow down, right? In deep, deep flow states, time slows to a crawl. What the heck is that? Well, turns out we learned, that in flow, one of the things that's happening is parts of the brain are shutting down, including large swatches of the prefrontal cortex, the kind of foremost part of your brain that houses your sense of will and morality and complex decision making and your sense of self. Turns out David Eagleman at Baylor figured out that time is calculated all over the prefrontal cortex. And when parts of it start to wink out, right, turn off in flow. And some of this is essentially an efficiency device trying to save energy because so much is being burned up in the state. But when parts of the prefrontal cortex are shut down, we can no longer calculate time. So past, present, and future kind of blur together into what researchers call the deep now.
The moment of now, right? I've seen you call it the elongated now, the eternal moment.
The deep now. The elongated now was Philip Zimbardo, a Stanford researcher. That was his term for it. But by the way, when time is removed from the equation, of course, this has an enormous performance benefit because all of our kind of fears and hopes take place outside of the present moment. They're in the future or in the past, right? So when those things get shut off, we are literally getting out of our own way. We're really free from a lot of stuff, which is why risk-taking goes way up, creativity goes way up.
So this also explains why I love to watch some of these Alan Watts YouTube videos, a man constantly reminding us about the moment of now.
There's a lot of research about it, right? This is literally, arguably, the oldest trick in the book, right? It's, trace any one of the world's wisdom traditions all the way back, and you're going to find kind of technologies, what Elade called, technologies of ecstasy, but ways of driving attention into the now. Because really amazing things happen when all of our attention is focused on the present moment.
I saw someone pepper you with the question about getting to flow state with drugs. And I thought it was great. And your response was, well, it was difficult to get there. And you can elaborate on this. Difficult to get there, if not impossible, artificially. But you described the street drugs that would correspond to the neurochemicals that are going on in our brain and what you would have to. Could you relay that? I was really fascinating how you described the street drugs and how they corresponded.
Let me give you a little context for this. So back in the 60s, 70s, there was this huge problem with kind of heroin addiction it was everywhere. But people had this question, which is, how is it we knew about neurochemicals and we knew that neurochemicals were these like lock and key systems, right? But what nobody could figure out is how heroin, the poppy plant, had been only around for 4,000 years. So what the heck was it doing in the brain that was fitting into this lock and key system, right? So why were we getting addicted, basically? And what we discovered is that every one of the street drugs, right, which is an exogenous, meaning external to the body, chemical, has an endogenous, meaning internal to the body, mimic, right? And the first one was discovered was endorphins. Endorphins are the brain's natural version of opiates, like heroin and morphine and OxyContin, things like this, right? Except the brain's version, incredibly more powerful. The most common, there are about 20 different endorphins in the brain. The most common one is about 100 times more potent than medical morphine, right? In flow, you get 5 of these chemicals. You get dopamine. Dopamine so cocaine is widely considered the most addictive drug on earth, right? All that happens when somebody snorts cocaine, or not all, but most of what happens is it forces the brain to release a neurotransmitter called dopamine, right? It is the most potent reward drug the brain can produce. In laboratory experiments, when they give rats access to kind of dopamine, basically they put electrodes into their brains. They can give them a button that they can press to stimulate these electrodes. The rats will starve to death pressing this button. They will literally stop eating because it's so much fun to press this button. We behave basically the same way when exposed to dopamine. You get anandamide, which mimics the kind of it's an endocannabinoid, so it mimics the same psychoactive in THC and marijuana. You get serotonin, which is what shows up in MDMA and ecstasy, also in LSD and psilocybin or magic mushrooms, depending on which pathway the molecule takes in the brain. And you also get norepinephrine, which is essentially our natural version of speed. So you get 5 of the most potent kind of street drugs possible. And the craziest part is you couldn't cocktail the street drugs, right? You would end up in a coma or dead. Some of them cancel each other out. Cocaine and ecstasy, for example, dopamine is more potent than serotonin, so it'll swamp the ecstasy, and people will only be on cocaine. So you couldn't even do it, right? It's not actually possible. And the brain has figured out, not only how to cocktail these things together, but how to do it in a way that gets like the very best out of each of them. It's really an astounding state. It's really astounding the brain figured out how to maximize performance in this way.
Dig into the example of being in the flow state on stage. One of the things that I've noticed when I'm on stage, I can prepare, and if I have some slides, great, whatever. But when I get on stage and they say go, something happens. And then when it's over, I generally don't remember what I said.
Yeah, I don't know. I give a ton of speeches, and 90% of the time, by the time I get to my last slide, I have the same reaction. Oh crap, this is the last slide. How did I get here? I must have missed something. What did I forget? And it happens all the time. It's happened so much now that I know that like when that feeling comes, it's actually a sign that I've given a good speech and I can relax. But, I've had that experience so many times. And so this gets into some interesting stuff. The first is that flow states have triggers, as I pointed out. Big picture, right? All these triggers are simply ways of kind of grabbing hold of our attentional system and driving focus and attention into the present moment, right? Onto the task at hand. The most obvious of these is what's called high consequences, right? You need to take risks to get into flow, right? Physical risks work great, which is one of the reasons that action and adventure sport athletes are so phenomenal at reproducing flow. But you don't obviously have to take physical risks, intellectual risks, emotional risks, social risks. The cool thing about social risks, and this includes public speaking, is that the brain can't actually tell the difference between social pain, social fear, social risk, physical pain, physical fear, and physical risk. They're literally processed by the exact same neuronal structures. And that sounds really strange until you realize that, 250 years ago, if you screwed up socially, right, and you got kicked out of the tribe, exiled or banished, which was really incredibly common, it was a capital sentence, right? You couldn't survive on your own in the wild. It wasn't really possible. So the brain treats these as the same, which is why public speaking, right, is the number one fear in the world, right? And it's not something like getting mauled by a grizzly bear. You would think it's the grizzly bear, right, from an evolutionary perspective, but no, it's public speaking.
But hold up. But guys like me and you that have been there, now it's like, just give us the stage so we can get our fix.
Agreed. But there is still, I don't know about you. I've been talking in public 20 years now. I don't know how long time. But I still I look out at the audience and I still, it's not the first couple of seconds of the speech, it grabs hold of my attention. It doesn't matter when I'm in a room and there's, 2,000 people in the room with me. My body reacts kinesthetically and unconsciously to their presence. And there's not, it's gonna drive attention into the now for sure. And, there's more going on than that as well in terms of there's kind of more flow triggers packed into public speaking, but most people find who get good at it, right? Who becomes an income stream for them and, really good at flow, right? And you see, by the way, not just public speaking. When we talk about screen presence, of course, we're talking about flow.
You mean screen presence? You're talking Hollywood acting, whatnot.
Yeah. When you see anybody on stage, it could be a musician, it could be an actor, screen presence in the movies, on television, you're looking at flow.
I watched The Godfather 1 and 2 recently again. For what reason, I'm not sure. It came on TV. I can't turn it off. But to watch Brando, to watch Pacino, you can't stop. They're just everything they do in those movies is amazing.
Method acting, right? What's the goal there? The goal is to get so far inside your character that you disappear and the character can take over. Method acting means putting yourself deep into the struggle phase, right? Until you have kind of learned everything you can about that character. And then you literally relax into that character and can become that character. It's an automatic process. And it's, on a certain level, method acting is all about how do you train yourself up to get into flow when the time comes.
Obviously, you are putting forth a lot of effort in this area with the Flow Genome Project, your writings. It's probably, people have experienced this, but connecting the dots like you've done is not something most people have probably achieved. So I'm sure there's going to be quite a few people who are going to listen to this conversation and go, wow, light bulb moment. But the military, the United States military, and perhaps other militaries around the world, have been in this area of research for a long time. This is like mission critical. So I assume if I was to bring this conversation up, and I had a buddy in San Diego a couple years ago who was a SEAL, this is probably par for the course of those guys.
So, couple of things. Look, as you pointed out, military has definitely been here. There's 150 years worth of flow research dating back, to the 1870s. Recently, both the military and action adventure sport athletes have been very, very, very deep into this. And we consult, through the Flow Genome Project with both categories, right? We've been privileged to work with both groups of people. But the reason most people don't hear about it is, right, neither the military nor action adventure sport athletes really want you to know about it, right? The military needs the advantage over their enemies, obviously. And action adventure sport athletes, they want to win. They want to beat the other guy. Neither of these groups are really sharing, right? And simultaneously, and this is sort of where I got lucky in a sense, researchers involved in this, because it's so complicated. There are so many different disciplines that kind of merge together, were really not talking to one another. So, people who would work on the psychology of flow were not talking to people who were working on the neurochemistry of flow. We're not talking to people working on the neuroelectricity of flow. It was very, 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 very balkanized. So there was a great opportunity to just bring all this stuff together. And that's, literally when the Flow Genome Project started, right? It started out with me saying, okay, let's just get all the smartest folks in the world on this topic together in one room and see what happens. And what actually happened, because we did that very early on in the Flow Genome Project, before Rise of Superman came out, the term was so loosely defined and there was not enough kind of broad understanding of all the sectors that the conversations went all over the place. And one of the reasons I wrote Rise of Superman was I felt you just had to put down in one place at one time all the research, everything that's been done in one place, so everybody could get on the same page and we can start having the more interesting conversations.
As I'm thinking about you talking about this, I'm thinking the idea of comfort. And society, as we've evolved to in 2014, has developed so many hacks for comfort. Everybody has to be comfortable. If somebody's doing something wrong or they're not pushing themselves too hard, well, don't say anything. You don't want to mess up their comfort. But the reality is, I listen to you talk, risk is not just necessarily something, risk can be defined as loss. What are you willing to lose? But taking that risk, if you don't take a risk, if you don't get uncomfortable, if you're not a little uneasy, if it's not difficult, you're not going to get to these achievement levels in whatever your endeavor might be unless you do that. The risk is mission critical.
There's another one of Flow's triggers. Probably its most famous trigger is what's known as the challenge skills balance, right? And this was discovered by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who many consider the godfather of flow psychology. He was the chairman of the University of Chicago Psychology Department back in the 60s and 70s, performed kind of the largest global flow study anybody's ever undertaken, learned a ton of stuff, including kind of the challenge skills balance. And the idea here is that our attention is most focused on the present moment when the challenge of the task at hand, right? The challenge of what we're about to do, or what we're trying to do, slightly exceeds our skill set, right? Not a lot. We want to stretch, but not snap. But stretching, even in this way, also means taking risks. It means pushing yourself past your comfort zone. To really, really hack flow, you have to get really comfortable with being uncomfortable. By the way, this is not just flow theory. If you kind of look at Anders Ericsson and expert performance theory, right? The challenge skills ratio is fundamental in expert performance theory. It's known kind of across the board. There's so much research on this. It's kind of silly at this point. But to bring out our very best, you have to constantly be stretching, constantly be uncomfortable. And what's interesting here is there's a lot of correlation. People who are really good at hacking flow tend to perform very, very well for perseverance and grit and things like that. And there's this mistaken idea that to get yourself into flow, you have to take on these huge challenges, right? You don't. It's a low, you want to be uncomfortable, but you can't push yourself too far, because if you get too anxious, if there's too much fear, right, you're going to start to move yourself out of the flow sweet spot and into fight or flight. Very different things happen in the brain, right? Fight or flight reduces your options, basically. In fight or flight, you have three choices. You can fight, you can flee, or you can freeze. Flow is options wide open. It's an extraordinarily creative state. It's the opposite of that. If you start to move into fight or flight, it actually shuts down the brain's pattern recognition system. You won't be able to come up with those new ideas in flow. So you want to stretch but not snap, but you have to do it day in, day out, year in, year out. So there's a willingness to push forward that is always there.
You mentioned Anders. I'm going to have him on my show too. I use my Florida State alumni connection there to kind of pull him in and say, come on, Anders, you got to come on. Hey, I got one last question for you, Steven. What do you want to know at this moment in your life, this moment of all these years of research? What do you want to know about flow that you don't currently know yet?
This is essentially the goal of the Flow Genome Project. What we want to do is, right, we want the source code. What that really means is we've got about 150 years of flow psychology. We've got about 25 years of flow neurobiology and physiology, right? So mind and brain, we've got a handle on, and we're starting to get a pretty good handle on. Body, it's kind of a black hole, because the measurement technologies we've needed to kind of link all these things up haven't shown up until very, very recently. So what we want to do is map the psychology onto the neurobiology, onto the physiology, to create kind of a heat map for flow, right? So that's, at a large level, that's what I want. At a much smaller, simpler level, the first thing we're working on right now is a biophysical detector for flow, because we've got phenomenally well-validated psychological metrics, subjective questionnaires, but we'd like something objective. We'd like something biophysical. So that's what we're working on right now.
Fascinating stuff. If I was not doing what I'm currently doing, and this is the type of, what an exciting place to be in chasing down this learning path. I wish you all the best. Thanks for coming on today. And there's a couple different places that people can go to check you out. What websites can we send people to, Steven?
StevenKotler.com, theflowgenomeproject.com, and riseofsuperman.com.
Yes, I have not mentioned that yet, but The Rise of Superman is your book that came out this year, which dives into this subject deep, and I think you will definitely have inspired people to check that out. Good stuff, Steven. I could talk to you all day. I promised only 45 minutes. That's about where we're at, but I could keep pestering you questions, and we could get into the itsy bitsy details, but I think people are going to have to go dig in and do a little reading.
Well, thanks, Michael. It was a ton of fun.
I appreciate it. Thanks, Steve. I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.